We are in the book of Joshua, and last week I believe we concluded in chapter 10. And just a surface reading of this book would be a lot of battles, a lot of names that we're not familiar with. It ranges from violent to boring, all at the same time. But there's a message that we've been looking into that is far greater than just that idea of a nation going to battle, waging war, and taking land. And that is that God has told his chosen people to go into this land. For what reason? For what purpose?
It's given to them.
Okay?
So they were supposed to just take it, and it was going to be their land and serve him.
Okay? To what purpose? It's a little more difficult question, isn't it? To what purpose? While you contemplate that, let me ask you another question that I think will help lead us to the answer to that first question. Why are the Canaanites and all the other people, and Canaanites a broad term, why are they being removed from the land?
Because they was worshiping false gods.
Okay, they're worshiping false gods. Can we go a little deeper into that?
The land was meant for the Jews.
Land was meant for the Jews?
It was God's chosen people, and that's the land that God wanted them to have.
Okay. This is typically how this is always framed. You know, they were worshiping false gods. God promised it to the land. But we're told.
Show everybody that he was Lord through them.
Okay? He's going to show everyone that he is the true God, the Lord. Marissa says, absolutely. How so?
Through his people.
Through his people?
And what he allowed his people to do, God was with them when they was destroying thousands of people. You know, the one example when Gideon had the one where like the drank water like you're supposed to and not like a dog. He had those 30 or so guys take out hundreds, and then like hundreds to one.
Okay, so we're jumping back a little bit into chronologically and in the Bible back to the book of Judges when we're talking about Gideon. Bob, you're getting a concept, I wasn't sure if Marissa was thinking of this either, of power. Demonstrating power, right? Is there anything else? Let's come back to Exodus 19, if you would. What's going on in Exodus 19? Do you remember?
They're at Sinai. He's about to give them the Ten Commandments.
Yep, we're at Mount Sinai, getting ready to get the Ten Commandments. The reason that is significant is after they're organized, they then go up to take the Promised Land the first time, and the people balk. And God takes them into the wilderness for 40 years. And when they come back into the Promised Land under Joshua, it's still for this same purpose. Verse 4 through 6. Could someone read that for me? Exodus 19, 4 through 6.
Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you out unto myself. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye should be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou speak unto the children of Israel.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So, God says, I'm going to make this covenant with you, right? And what's this covenant going to make you? A nation of priests.
A peculiar people.
Peculiar people. Unlike any other people, right? This should sound familiar to us because Peter repeats it to the Christian people, right? It wasn't just about power. In fact, it's not primarily about power. It's not even about the land being given to his people. It was about creating a nation who, as Jesus brought up, was to be a city on a hill. Right? Represented. What's a priest do? Represents people to God and God to the people. Right? This is what my people are supposed to look like. This is the kind of God I am shown through my people. A nation of justice. A nation who looks out for the poor. A nation who's reverent to their ancestors. Right? We could go on and on and on with those things. What the people, the Canaanites were doing is they're not only worshiping other gods, they're committing detestable acts, right? Or as we looked a few weeks ago at some of the practices they were involved with, to me the most grotesque is they're sacrificing their children to Molech. Right? And Israel is to come in and to show what God's people is to be like. Right? To be completely different than Canaan. So, as we look at Joshua, it's not just about a lot of battles. It's about God reclaiming the land to establish his people. They're going to act very different than the Canaanites. What's the problem with the plan? The enactment of it, right? What do they do when they get into the land? You look at the prophets, they're perverting justice, they're oppressing the poor. They even go as far as to start sacrificing their children. Right? They weren't different. And Mike, that's why I said you're absolutely right. The land was given to his people, but not unconditionally. It was given to them for a purpose. And they became just like the nations that he took it from. In the book of Deuteronomy prophesied that I will spew you out of the land the same as I did these people if you do that. So the point being, it's not a nation waging war. That's not the primary story. The story is God cradling his people to be something very, very different. And that's why we see this phrase over and over, and Bob and Marissa kind of got on the edges of this. Throughout chapter 10, it's 3 times. It's in verse 14. For the Lord fought for Israel. When verse 42, for the Lord fought for Israel. Right? I said 3 times in that chapter. It's actually in chapter 7, verse 6, where he says, I will give over all of them. The idea is God is doing this. The reason I wanted to open up with that reminder of what's going on. Questions before we move on from that. I left you with a question last week, and Sharon's with us tonight. She called and had an answer, and we talked about her answer, and she said, well, I can't wait to hear what you say, because I wouldn't tell her. So you're going to have to wait until Wednesday. So she's waiting. Hello, Leslie, by the way. It's good to have you with us as well. The question was, when Jericho fell, God said everything was to be destroyed. Don't take anything for yourself. And of course, we know Achan did, and that caused great problems. But after that, when they actually win at Ai, and in all the battles in chapter 10, because in chapter 10 there was numerous battles listed that they won, we noted that they took the plunder for themselves. Now why, the question that I left you with last week is, why would God say, don't take anything at Jericho, and then even cause defeat over someone taking stuff, and then say, okay, next battle, it's all yours. 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 Why would he do that? You haven't figured that out yet. What was that, Sally?
Did he do that?
I still didn't hear you.
Did he do that? Did he say that?
Yes, he did. So that's a good question. So possibly are they taking it for themselves and not being authorized or given permission to do that? But yes, they were given permission. He says, take it for yourselves. Go ahead, Fred.
Usually offered to God first. And this would be their first victory.
Okay.
Over there.
That's very close to what Sharon said too. And I think that's absolutely a big part of it. That idea that the first fruits were establishing a principle that the first is given to God, right? And my mind goes just a little bit deeper than that. Related to what Brad just said. Any other thoughts before I give you my feeble thoughts? I think it very much lays down the principle of what they're to do with the land. It belongs to God. It's all God's. If they have anything for themselves, it's because He gives it to them. If you take it for yourselves, it's not going to work out. And so, absolutely, it's the whole idea of first fruits, right? And God says, no, it's all mine. And then, after that was established, He says, here, take for yourself, take freely, take freely. I think there's a strong principle in our lives as we look at what Israel was meant to be and what we're meant to be. When we take things for ourselves to use selfishly, trouble comes. Harm comes. Jesus said something similar to this in the Sermon on the Mount. Seek ye first. Thought someone might say second. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and all of His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. We see that principle, I think, in Jericho versus Ai. That when they were willing to give it all over to God, they were blessed richly. When they were hoarding for themselves, it wasn't going to go well at all. Questions or comments? That is not expressly stated, so that's just my take on why that is. All right, so with that, in chapter 10, we took the southern part of Canaan. And now Gilgal, where we are camping, is kind of northwest plain. It's right in the middle. So they've come in first, they've went south, and they've conquered the southern part of the land. And now in chapter 10, they're going to move northward and conquer the northern part of Canaan. We're going to see the people that live in the north are a little different than those in the south. Would someone read 1 through 5 for me, please? Oh, fair warning, there's lots of names in 1 through 5. I'll blunder through those names and just to take the punishment, not because I can pronounce them better than anyone, but to take the punishment, and then we'll hand off the reading. Starting in verse 1, Joshua 11:1. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent to Jabab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Ashaph, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country and the Arabah, south of Chinero, and in the lowland, and in Naphoth Dor on the west. It's the last time I have a conscience, so I ask people to read. Verse 3. To the Canaanites in the east and in the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out with all their troops, a great horde, in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came and camped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Now, I read studies where all these names, in-depth studies, are put into where they were in the history, and it is really interesting to see how many of these names and places tie back into other places in the Bible. And without that, sometimes we look at these names and we say, okay, so? I know sometimes my eyes glaze over reading them, but bear in mind that for the Israelites, these all would have been places they're very familiar with. They're talking about the people of Corsica and the people of New Bethlehem and the people of Punxsutawney. And so their heritage is tied deeply into these concepts, into these places. And it's being preserved about where and how these battles took place. But these people in the north, they've band together, and how numerous were they? Was there a few of them? Quite a few of them? Like the sand of the seashore. That's a lot, right? And that's what's meant by that statement. There's a lot. When you come out to the hillside and you look out into the battlefield, all you saw was soldiers. Well, that's not quite accurate. You saw something worse than soldiers, didn't you? What did you see? Chariots. Chariots. That's a bad deal. That's the tank of the day, right? Now, I mentioned this last week, and we saw how Joshua and the Israelites traveled through the night at times and took enemies by surprise at Gibeon and conquered them. And I mentioned that they were known to travel real light. So if you have nothing more than a leather vest for armor, chariots are a pretty bad deal, right? Really bad deal. So are the people likely to be fearful? Yeah. And by the way, I said at the beginning of this that the people in the north were different than the south. it would seem as though the civilizations in the north were just more advanced, because we didn't see chariots in the south. We did in Egypt, right? Going that far south. But throughout the conquest here, we've not seen anything like this. So now these kings are banding together, and they've got a real force. I'm mindful of a recent picture that we've all saw in the news recently of the long line of Russian tanks and armored vehicles and soldiers coming into Ukraine. And you can imagine, sounds like they're having way more fun than us. We need to find out who's teaching down there and have them teach up here next week. But I can imagine how intimidating that is if you're living in that country where this immense army is coming towards. And that's what Israel's facing at this point. Question or comments? Bob pointed this out early, and of course I've emphasized it. God's fighting the battle, though, right? So that's the reason there's no need to fear. On the human side, there's a lot of reason right now to fear. All right, we've got through most of the names. So would someone read verses 6 through 15, please?
And the Lord said unto Joshua, Be not afraid because of them, for tomorrow upon this time when I deliver them up all slain before Israel, thou shalt hog their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua came, and all the people of war with him against them by the waters of Merom suddenly, and they fell upon them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who smote them and chased them unto the great Zidion, and unto the unto the valley of Mizpah eastward, and they smote them until they left them none remaining. And Joshua did unto them as the Lord bade him. He hogged their horses and burnt their chariots with fire. And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword. For Hazor before time was heard of all those kingdoms. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe. And he burnt Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings, and all the kings of them did Joshua take, and smote them with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord commanded. But as for the cities that stood there in their strength, Israel burnt none of them, save Hazor only that did Joshua burn. And all the spoils of these cities and the cattle, the children of Israel took them for a prey on themselves. But every man they smote with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, neither left they any to breathe. And as the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so did Moses command Joshua. And so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all the Lord commanding Moses.
Okay, thank you. So we've emphasized this part that God is fighting the battles for them, right? And that He's doing the work. But there's something to me that's really interesting. Starting in verse 6, God says to Moses, yes, to Joshua, the Lord says to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give them over, all of them over, or I will give over all of them. He says, don't be afraid. I'm going to give you the whole army. It's going to be a tremendous victory for you. So God's going to do that. But notice verse 7. How does it happen? It's actually pretty easy to overlook. What's the first phrase of description of what Joshua and the warriors did? Suddenly. Suddenly. Again, we've talked about the fact that Joshua as a general studied to this day. And what he's most praised for is for rapid and quick attacks, right? Moving quickly, covering land, and taking enemies by surprise. Can you see in verse 7? That appears to be exactly what he did. They are preparing for battle. I mean, we've seen this in history numerous times. They're preparing for battle, and they think they're going to have a specific kind of battle. And while they're preparing for the battle, Joshua attacks, likely from a flank. What we do know is it was suddenly. Here's my point. Although God gave it to them, we sometimes say, well, yeah, but they had to actually do it. But more than that, they still had to use good techniques. It wasn't as though all wisdom was off the table. I'm going to do this for you. God still is using Joshua's wisdom to lead the army. In fact, that's one of the ways he gave it to them. Something of great import for us, and there's an important balance here, I think, in our lives. Sunday night, I used Romans 12:3 in the lessons. We look at Saul's arrogance or haughtiness, right? That every man ought not think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly. Right? Arrogance is a killer. It's horrible. But sometimes we go this other extreme, and it's almost like we believe the people don't matter. That wisdom doesn't matter. That our approach doesn't matter. That's not what we see in Scripture. We see that one of the ways that God uses or gives the battle over is by giving them the way. I think it's very important that we keep that in mind. That we don't just say God's will be done. That we strive for wisdom, knowledge, and strength.
But God expects us to, He will do the power through us.
Yes.
Not that we're going to be killing people, but we're, unless He calls us to.
Spiritual battle.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we need to use our talents if you have a talent, even if you don't know what it is. God will show you.
And that's a great point, because Romans 12:3 is the beginning of the idea that we ought to use our spiritual gifts, right? And so we are important. Each of us are important for the task. So I thought that was interesting. So they leave none remaining. They completely defeat the army. In fact, they roll through the army, if you will. And I've got to mention, what did God tell them to do with the horses?
Tendons in the back.
Yes. So right below the hindquarters, they would cut their hamstrings.
Walk anymore.
Yeah, from my studies, they are able to walk. They're just probably not immediately. They're completely useless for any battle, any war. I read one article that said they could still plow. I think whoever wrote that article doesn't know much about horses, because horses are designed to drive from the back, not pull with the front. So they would be completely useless for battle, and probably for most labor, for that matter.
Did that then.
So it was, Bob says that's why they did that. It was a common tactic when you encountered horses and defeated armies on the battle. It was a common tactic. If you couldn't immediately use that horse, you hamstrung it. And that way it couldn't be used against you. So again, we're looking at verse 7 about tactics, right? There's a tactic. However, how many horses does the Israelite army have? None. And so this is kind of an obvious question now that we answered that one. How many chariots do they have? None. I mean, how many of you have seen some of the memes about the Ukrainian farmers stealing tanks? I guess there's an actual picture of a John Deere tractor pulling a tank off the road. And now there's some jokes out there about the highest predator in the area is the Ukrainian farmer. They're out there preying on tanks, right? But if you got an enemy's tank, what would be the best thing you could do with it? Yeah, if you could drive it, I'd cause a wreck, I'm sure. Use it, right? And that's what most armies would do. You only hamstring a horse if you can't use it for yourself. Why would God have them hamstring them rather than use them?
Like the way they were doing it, they were light on their feet, they had their tactics set that way, and they didn't want to change a good thing.
Okay, there's a strategic reason. You don't fix what's not broke, right? We're winning the battle. Mom and Brad.
Well, it could be, didn't want to see the battle was won by the help of the horses.
Okay.
God's the one that was really in control.
Okay, Brad?
About the same thing. I mean, it's early on here, and God is trying to teach them to depend on Him. And if they start having horses and chariots, they're now going to start to think that they're winning these battles themselves, which defeats the purpose.
Exactly. And you two are on the same page. And Mike, that from a I'm struggling tonight. From a tactic standpoint, you could rationalize that. Something interesting when we get a little deeper into the story and we have kings, one of the things the kings are told to do is don't accumulate horses. Don't accumulate horses. Dad missed that memo. Yeah, Chris. Missed that memo altogether. The reason is believe exactly what Mom and Brad have said. That their strength, their reliance on strength is to be in God. Remember what got David in more trouble than anything else? I mean, you're thinking about Bathsheba. But there was something else seemed kind of innocent. Didn't seem like a big deal, and it got David in really big trouble. He numbered his people. Why was that such a big deal? Because he's saying, do I have enough soldiers to win the battle? My strength. This is a man of battle his whole life. Now he's saying, how many soldiers do I have? Do I have enough to go out and win the battle? When reliance was to be on God. I think that's exactly why we're hamstringing these horses here versus using them. That's not our reliance. And by the way, I would be biased, but horses were the war engine of the day. The deadliest, most valuable war utensil you could possibly have. So with that then, they turn and they just start winning battle after battle, one after another. And I'm going to read 16 through the end because there's important point that I want to draw out before we conclude here tonight. Joshua 11, starting in verse 16. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all the Negeb, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and its lowland. From Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir, as far as Belgad, the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. And he captured all the kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Verse 21, and Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron and Debir and Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. And there was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and in Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. So did you notice verse 18? How long were they at war? A long time. So they were a long time. So we have this quite lengthy list. Remember, basically what we're doing is we're going north throughout Canaan and conquering it at this point. And the Lord is doing two things. He's giving them over in battle, and he's hardening the hearts of the inhabitants so that they are fighting. The rationale is here that you would think when you see them coming, after they've defeated everyone else, that you'd say, okay, let's make a deal. And that's not happening. They're continuing to fight, although they're losing battle after battle. Verse 21 is where I wanted to get to. This is really, really important. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country. Who are the Anakim? Giants. They're the giants. This verse is huge for Joshua. Huge verse right here and concept. So, back to Moses. We were at Mount Sinai when we started this evening, and they came to the southern part of the Promised Land, sent in 12 spies, and the spies went all throughout the land, including the hill country. And what did they see that melted their hearts? Giants. We're but grasshoppers in comparison to them. This verse is showing, as we summarize all those battles, because chapter 12 is essentially just a long list. We're not going to read chapter 12 next week, but it's a long list of names of defeated people. And in chapter 13 starts into inheriting or dividing the land. And so we are ending this battle, this list of battles, by saying we even got the giants and cut them off from the land. Go ahead.
They kept winning, so we should just give up. Maybe that's why the Lord had hardened their heart.
I didn't quite hear you.
In verse 20,
Okay?
for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against the Israel in battle. Maybe they didn't want to battle them because they saw they kept winning.
Yeah.
That's why the Lord had to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the implication. Naturally, they would have given up and not battled if it had not been for supernatural cause that say otherwise. Interesting point is we end tonight. In the Garden of Eden, we have this beautiful picture, right? And then we have a giant enter, a giant enemy, right? In the form of a serpent. And destroys everything. That's the first rebellion in Genesis. The second rebellion's in chapter 6, where we see the Nephilim come about. These giants plague the land for a long time, clear through David. Joshua kills them, and then David kills them. They're both types of Jesus. The message is that God's going to send a Messiah. It's going to kill your giant. It's going to be able to fight the battle for you. In fact, something interesting about 1 Samuel 17, people who are more knowledgeable than me note that the description of Goliath's brass armor resembles a snake, the scales of a snake. And David, the type of the Messiah, is coming in and slaying that giant serpent. Verse 21 is a really interesting verse of Joshua 11. Questions or comments? Thank you for your time, and Lord willing, I normally say we'll pick up there, but we'll continue in Joshua next week.